My name is Stephanie Waller. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the program director at Grantmakers for Education. On behalf of our entire team, I'd like to welcome you to From Neurons to Nation, early learning that fosters democratic ideals. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, Trust for Learning and the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative for organizing this session in partnership with us today. Today's program is the first in a five-part series that will explore formative experiences for children and youth and our country's democratic ideals. At a cultural and political moment where democracy itself is under attack, we want to draw some parallels between the early development of our nation and the early development of children and youth in terms of provocations for the field of philanthropy and for all of us in community about what kinds of mindsets, practices, and commitments are required in this moment to not just show up, but remain steadfast in the work of pursuing equity and ensuring all young people have access to high quality learning environments that recognize, celebrate, and center their full humanity. We are joined by truly a phenomenal group of expert speakers today, and we encourage you to engage with and respond to what you're hearing in the chat. I'm honored to introduce our moderator, Dr. Hioma Aruka, who will facilitate the conversation and introduce our additional speakers. Dr. Aruka is an award-winning research professor in the Department of Public Policy and founding director of the Equity Research Action Coalition at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She will begin as a tenured professor of maternal child health at UNC Gilling School of Public Health in the fall. As an applied developmental psychologist, Hioma is focused on ensuring minoritized children and children from low-income households thrive during the prenatal through early childhood period through the intersection of anti-bias, anti-racist, and culturally grounded research, program, and policy. Her specialty is in early childhood development, adult-child interactions and relationship, and policy and program improvement through anti-racist and cultural wealth approaches. We're honored to have Hioma here today, and without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm so honored to be here with you. And of course, our panelists who I'm going to introduce shortly, but also really so glad to be here with all of you, the participants who are taking time from what I think may be a summer break, reprieve, restorative time to be here with us to really have this critical and timely conversation. And I hope you're somewhere cool and warm, at least cool, I should say, not warm, since a lot of us are probably going through a massive heat wave. So thank you again for being here. And of course, thanks to Trust for Learning, Grantmakers for Education, and the Early Child Founders Collaborative for stepping forward to co-host what they call, and I also call, a provocative series connecting the dots on children's formative experiences in public funded learning environments and our country's democratic ideals. Again, my name is Hioma Aruka. Like any country, there are moments of peace, unrest, and everything in between, and not all of us feel it the same way. And as the title for this series portends, From Neurons to Nation, our democracy in the US is relatively young when you compare to some others, still laying some foundations, struggling with its identity from ideal to actual. We're currently seeing the importance of truth telling, but also how truth telling can lead to great denial. We have seen that any semblance of progress for social, economic, and psychological justice has been met with greater resistance, including from our legal, legislative, and social institutions. However, this progress for liberation will not be and cannot be stopped. And a part of that starts with us on this call, but most importantly, with the kind of learning environments our youngest learners are in that creates a civically conscious and social justice approach and mindset. So of course, as moderator, as I was thinking about how do I best set this up, this conversation, I can seem smart, with our brilliant, provocative panel, right? The one book that I was like, okay, I know they always have something good to say is actually from W.E.B. Du Bois' book, The Gift of Black Folks. And I just wanted to just read one small section, but again, you should read all his books, of course. But this one I thought was a good setup for our conversation. And then one of the things I want to read is this. So he says the following: he used his own judgment and he fought because he believed that by fighting for America, he would gain the respect of the land and personal and spiritual freedom. His problem as a soldier was always peculiar. No matter for what America fought, and no matter for what her enemies fought, the American Negro always fought for his own freedom and for the self respect of his race. Whatever the cause of war, therefore, his cause was peculiarly just. He appears, therefore, in American wars always with double motive: the desire to oppose the so called enemy of his country along with his fellow white citizens, and before that, the motive of deserving well of those citizens and securing justice for his folk. And I just thought that that was just to me apropos before our conversation, because we are in this moment where some of us are fighting for truth and justice, and some of us are probably doing the opposite. However, the question is, what are we each of us going to do to fight for liberation, to fight for humanity, but really to fight for the ideals that our country stands on, but in particular, with a focus on our youngest children, who we know we're trying to save this country and democracy for. So some of the questions that we'll explore in this first conversation are things like, what do we know from research about identity development for all children in the earliest years of life? How broadly do we define civic identity? What's at stake in the earliest years of civic development? So we'll go through some of those questions with our great panelists. So now I will now take the time to introduce them to you. The first, Dr. Fabienne Doucette. Dr. Doucette is Executive Director of the NYU Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools, and Associate Professor of Early Childhood Education and Urban Education in the Department of Teaching and Learning at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. She's an affiliated faculty member of the NYU Institute for Human Development and Social Change and Center for Latin America and Caribbean Studies. Born in Spain, raised in Haiti, and migrated to the US at the age of 10, Fabienne embodies a hybrid identity that is mirrored in her interdisciplinary approach to examining how immigrants and US-born children of color and their families navigate education in the United States. A critical ethnographer, Fabienne studies how taken for granted beliefs, practices, and values in the US education system positions linguistically, culturally, and socioeconomically diverse children and families at a disadvantage, and seeks active solutions for meeting their educational needs. And now also to introduce Ellen Roche. Ellen leads media, philanthropic, and racial equity efforts at the Trust and studies infant and toddler brain and emotional development at the University of Maryland. Prior to joining the Trust for Learning, Ellen taught English and music to children from pre-K to high school and developed issue-based storytelling campaigns as a consultant. While earning her Master of Education at Harvard University, she studied the history of progressive democratic education in the US, civic education, and anti-racist pedagogy. As a development scientist, she is focused on bringing anti-racist practice into academic research and led the development of Trust for Learning's evidence brief in early 2022. And at the Trust, she works closely with the board, I should say, and philanthropic funders to steward the organization's development and aims to incorporate anti-racism and inclusion in all areas of their work. So with that, I welcome Ellen and Fabienne, and I will just to let you all know, just to lay the land, I'm going to engage both of them in about a 30-minute sort of conversation. So that means please get your questions ready. Feel free to put it in the chat. Also engage with each other on the chat as you hear from both Fabienne and Ellen. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump right in because I know we are eager to just start the conversation. So really, to get us started, I wanted to say, hey, Fabienne, Ellen, what elders or ancestors do you want to call into this room that we're in here? Go ahead, Fabienne.
Okay, so I'll start. So the elders that I want to call into this room are, one is my guardian angel, who is my great uncle, Pierre Monosier. He was an artist and a curator of Haiti's Museum of Art in Port-au-Prince, and he traveled the world, and he was one of the first known cases of AIDS in the early 80s. And so he died when I was 9 years old, but he was one of my favorite human beings, and we had an incredible connection. Just very, very special, very special. And I have felt him with me my entire life. And I know that he is with me every day. So I invite him into this space, and I also invite my great aunt and uncle who raised me in Haiti, Fito and Titine, my mom and dad, who were technically not my mom and dad, but they raised me as my mom and dad. And they made me who I am. They loved me beyond reason. They inspired me. They filled me. They prayed for me. They taught me how to be a human being, you know, like fully living into humanity with care and compassion for others. They were so loving. Their love just overflowed. And so those are the people that I'm bringing into the room with me.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, we welcome them, honestly and truly. Ellen, anybody would like to call in to the room?
The woman that I thought of in advance is Dr. Carol Ann North. She was one of my first mentor teachers when I started in DC as a teacher when I was in my early 20s. She was an English teacher at Anacostia High School, and I came in as a volunteer as part of a human rights program that she had signed up for to engage her class in a 9-week human rights education program through Amnesty International. And working with her really helped me to decide that I wanted to be a teacher. But she also was, I learned a ton from her, but one of the first lessons that I learned right away, I'm 22, I'm, you know, coming in with this sort of anti-racist spirit and this vision of human rights. And immediately she really reflected to me explicitly and implicitly that her first job as a teacher was to love her students. And all the sort of frameworks of human rights and social justice and all these things that I thought, you know, were so important and still do, she really just cut to the chase. And that was an incredibly important relationship. And I'm still grateful for her mentorship and guidance. She's now retired. And the other person, I felt I had to, you know, based on sort of the way the stars aligned, my Aunt Mary Ellen texted me and my sister today that today is the 100, would have been the 100th birthday of my grandmother. And I'm just going to informally show you guys her picture. So that's Mary Roche, born Mary Casey. And the reason I don't ever think of her really when I am thinking about my work at the Trust or most of my work, but it felt timely to name her because she was the first child born in that side of the family as a US citizen. Both of her parents were born in Ireland in the 1890s. And this is sort of the moment of transition in my family from being Irish to being white. And, you know, that was a terrible deal, but that was the deal that they made, that they were offered. And so she didn't learn Irish, she didn't know the songs. So all of that was lost in that deal. So I feel like that's important to name too.
Well, thank you for sharing that as well. And I think we'll come back to, I think, what does it mean to create democracy and what do you gain and what do you sometimes lose? But I'm glad Stephanie put in the chat. For others who may want to chime in on the chat, feel free about what elders and ancestors are you bringing into the space. If you want to share, feel free to do that. And I will also take the license to say I definitely call in my grandfather, my maternal side, Charles, who my son is named after, and he was head of the Red Cross. And to me, he always just showed me how to just take life and just go, right? So he was the let's go with it. And so I miss him dearly. He took care of me when my mother was working many jobs. And so I definitely call him here. And I know he's always with me. So but please share, others please share as well as you feel comfortable. Thank you both. So now let's jump into our conversation and really set the context of this moment. And Ellen, I'm going to ask you to kind of, help us, and obviously Fabian will add as well, is how are we all understanding this current moment that we're in? There's so much going on. So how are we understanding it? Can you provide a little bit of a historical context? That would be really helpful.
Yeah, so I will just kick this off by saying, for me personally, I am trying to spend the next 106, I think, days until the election, working, not worrying. That is my motto for the summer and the fall. And really trying to think about the larger arc of justice and liberation in this country and the progress that we make, the push back against that progress, and this being what feels like a really sensitive and critical period in our development as a democracy. So I'm not a historian in any way, officially, professionally, but I have some experience studying social movements of the past and educational movements of the past. And so I'm just going to toss in 2 quotes, and then I will hand off to you all to share more. But the first is from one of my heroes in education and anti-racism and organizing, Septima Clark. So if you on this call are not familiar with her, please take a moment and read about her after this call. She was a brilliant activist, organizer, educator in the South as part of the Freedom Schools movement. And she has this quote that I return to in these moments. I have great belief in the fact that whenever there is chaos, it creates wonderful thinking. I consider chaos a gift. So things feel very chaotic to me right now as a citizen, as a resident in this country. So is there a gift in this chaos, right? In this tumult? I mean, we planned this webinar series 6 weeks ago. And then a week ago, we were like, I'm glad we're talking about this, right? It's like every week, what's the next piece of news that is cause for both alarm, but also action? So that's Septima on the one hand. And then another favorite from the past, John Dewey. Democracy has to be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife. So I'll start there.
Anything you want to add, Fabienne, to that?
Gosh, that was really beautiful. Thanks, Ellen, for opening us up with that. I don't think I have much to add. I'm pretty much sitting in that same place of sort of there's a lot going on. This is, my pastor always says, these are hot mess times. So I'm just gonna echo her words. We are in some hot mess times.
It makes me actually think, and then I think just in reflecting some of the people who want to pass, they want you to pass all the quotes, and I'll pass my quotes as well. Is it also, I think, in many ways makes us think that there's certain things that have to happen. I think about sort of the former occupier of the White House who came in down the staircase, and I think we were in that sort of, people were thinking we were sort of post-racial, and that person reminded us we're really not. So I do think in some ways it was chaos for some people, but some of us were like, some of us knew the truth. We just needed others to actually see our truth and see our reality. So in some ways, I could actually really go with, Septima Clark, sort of like the gift of chaos, that at times that allows us to understand who's really here for justice and who's really performing it, right? In many ways. And so I think hopefully that's the way to think about it. So we continue to fight, particularly for our young children and for our families and those we're working on behalf of. So as we sort of continue this conversation about sort of, democracy, civic mindedness, social justice, where are our shared ideals, right? Because we're not going to talk about all the horribleness. There is, we can talk about it, we'll continue to do that. But where are some of our shared ideals? What are they? What can we look forward to? Ellen, do you want to take that on?
I'm happy to kick off with the thing I've been wrestling with and would love to talk with both of you more about this, is like, what is this concept of freedom, right? And it happens to be my grandmother's 100th birthday. And I know that the sort of vision of freedom that Irish immigrants were offered, as they traded their heritage for whiteness, was a limited and racist vision of freedom. And so I am trying to evolve my own mind around that. And I've been thinking about how sort of in anti-racist work, one of the things being a white person, that you have to think about is that there really is no neutral, right? Either you are proactively anti-racist or you are 100% part of the problem. And I've been trying to think through freedom from that lens too, that if we just continue to have this implicit, I think, sense that freedom is like sort of white picket fence, middle class, implicitly white normed, that we're missing visions of liberation from other cultures that hopefully become like the North Stars for our multicultural democracy. And we're not there yet, right? So how do we, as a very multicultural society, how do we move towards something that actually both represents more of our cultures, but is actually aspirational?
And while you're in, Fabienne, I want to bring you in here, but I also want to actually bring you in here because obviously with your Haitian roots, I don't think we fully value and respect that Haiti was the first independent nation. When we think about independent nations from colonialism, and to think about how it's seen and treated and still pays France money plus interest. Okay, so anyways, so again, I know we're talking about US and the birth of a nation, but we're also becoming more global. And so I would love to kind of hear you sort of, I think in some ways reflect both on sort of your own roots, particularly your Haitian roots. Are there shared ideals, whether it's in this country here, but even globally? Because I think we're becoming more global. A lot of things that we're experiencing is actually experienced across the globe. So just curious about your thoughts and what can we also learn from the continual fight for justice and freedom that I think Haiti really was the first to actually start.
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult because we have this incredible pride as Haitians in being the first independent Black nation and having inspired revolutions all over the world. People to this day, there are oppressed people to this day that look to Haiti as a source of inspiration. And yet the backlash, the punishment for daring to desire to be free we are still feeling its impacts. Like you said, the debt that we had to pay to France, the way that the country was ostracized, not recognized, not provided with other resources and education like other islands were. It has been a high price to pay, and we are still living those consequences. But one of the things that comes to me when I think about Haiti and kind of what we're currently living through in Haiti with gangs having taken over, and what is happening in the US is that these systems and structures of power and oppression are operating exactly as they were meant to. They're working really, really well. When we look to see that Haiti's in chaos right now, and in the US, we have communities living in chaos and going through chaos. That's because that's how those systems were set up, right? That's what it was always going to be. It's not it's not a blip. It's not oh my, what is going on here? No, it was set up for this. It was set up this way. It was set up so that there would always be people who are on the bottom, always be people who are on the top, that the people on the top would have white skin, mostly be male. That's how things were set up. And so we really need to look at that, be willing to name that, and then be willing to say, we have been living with this particular vision of the world, right? Where one group is on top and better than everyone else and blah, blah, blah. We've been living with that vision for centuries now. Whenever we talk about change, people, kind of like are hesitant and saying, but what would that mean? And what would this cause? And my thing is always like, well, why don't we just find out? We already know what the alternative looks like. We're living in it and it's rough. So why don't we try something else, right? At this point, what do we have to lose? I mean, I feel like we've lost everything, to be very honest. Some days I really feel like as a nation, like we've lost our soul. We've lost our humanity as a nation, and it's global as well. So we've already lost that. What else do we have to lose? Nothing. We might as well try something different and something new. And then something else to your first question about what we share. I think another thing that we share, at least on the surface, is a desire for things to be different for our children than they were for us and the people who came before us. What has been really disheartening is the way that for our children, for the future of our children, for their education, has been weaponized as a tool to continue to further oppression. That is really discomforting to me, because I think investing in the future, investing in a world that our children are going to be, they're going to be safe, they're going to have enough to eat, they're not going to, they're going to be able to live, and the climate's not going to be wild and all those things. Like, those are things that we sort of should agree on, right? But then they've become politicized in these ways that then make us feel like we're not even speaking the same language.
Yeah. No, I think you bring up really two, I think, really important points, right? Which is both the stratification and just the foundation of this country and one end, right? That and from your perspective, we have lost, right? And I would agree with you as a marginalized member of society in many ways, right? But now looking at sort of Ellen, your family, right, that said we're making a decision that we rather be on the top than the bottom or even the middle, right? We rather give up the Irish part, that forget all that. We rather get the whiteness is the tool of power. And so how do you sort of, for children who are seeing that, whether we talk about it or not, they are seeing that level of stratification, right? They know who is going to be at the top, whether it's based on your skin color, based on your gender, based on where you live. When you see that you're being rewarded in essence or privileged in essence based on that, how do we begin to change that, right? Because they're going to get these messages, but how do we change that, especially when people are making decisions based on, some people argue, their survival, right? So I don't know. Yeah, what is your response to that?
One thing I'll say is just to reiterate some of the research that we've discussed in the past, and just to make sure that folks in the audience are aware. And so much of this, Ioma, you reference in your book, so I will just give a shout out, your last book, I'll give a shout out for that. But we know that infants recognize their parents' voices from birth, right? From hearing it in utero. They recognize differences in skin tone. Of course, they haven't learned the concepts of race, as infants within the first year of life. They can recognize power between people within the first couple of years of life. So I think one of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation is that so much of the civic education conversation is middle and high school, I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill, 3 branches of government, you should vote, that's part of being a good citizen. But so much about identity development and how you're treated and how you are responded to by the adults in the room, children pick up on literally from birth. So I don't know how to reconcile all of that, but just to affirm the importance of thinking about this for families at a family level from the moment that their children, that they are pregnant and supporting their children, but from birth in publicly funded programs. So that was not really an answer, Ioma, but just to affirm the importance of this from day one and before.
No, I think it was important. And by the way, shameless plug, the book that Ellen was talking about is called We Are the Change We Seek, Advancing Racial Justice and Early Child Education. We'll put the link in somewhere or another whenever I figure it out, because the conversation is way more important. But I do want to have, Fabian give thoughts to this as well, right? So because in the end of it, right, our thought, right, our perspective, right, some of the perspective that we are a country that's losing in many ways because we have not fully leaned into our shared ideals. And so children are having to, in essence, make some decisions about which identity am I going to pick today, because that may determine my future, right? It's not a meritocracy as we want it to be fully, right? And so they're having to make some really huge decisions. And so how do we think about sort of issues of identity development in their relation to what that may mean for children in trying to create a more holistic sort of country, right, nation, where we actually care about others and not just ourselves. So I'm just, any thoughts you want to add to what Ellen had said?
Well, I think it's really important for us to have conversations with children, to recognize that children are actually very sophisticated thinkers. I mean, I think everybody in this room knows that. Children are such sophisticated thinkers and are capable of grappling with, contradictions and why things are unfair. These are things that children innately understand and are very much capable of sort of sitting with. Now, I don't want to imply that means that we're looking to children to solve problems, because I think that's on us, right, as the adults.
Right.
But I do think that we can't hide the problems from children because they see them. So we can tell ourselves that we're protecting them, but we're not protecting them because they are in the world. And so they are witnessing and experiencing the things that we are witnessing, experiencing, like you were talking about, Ioma, like they see, you know, these are the people who win, these are people who lose. So, you know, just as an example, I have mixed race kids. And so when we have conversations about race with, they're now 16 and 19 years old, but literally throughout their lives, we have conversations about race, about identity. And what does it mean to identify as white? What does it mean to say that my mom is Haitian? What does it mean when people don't believe you? What does it mean and why? And all of these things. And these are conversations, right, that we need to have. I wrote an article with Jennifer Adair that was published now 11 years ago, which is crazy, in 2013 in Young Children, where we talked about race being an ongoing conversation in early childhood classrooms. How do we make race an ongoing conversation? And I would say you can replace race with any of these kind of difficult issues, that it needs to be an ongoing conversation. Make space for children's questions, make space for their anger, make space for their frustration, make space for them to say, like, why have you done this? You know, this is wild and confusing, and we don't get it. And even though we might not get it and might not have all of the answers, at the very least, we owe them the respect that is due to them in saying, yes, we have made this mess. Let us at least acknowledge the mess, not pretend like it's, you know, kind of not really happening, not pretend like all this history didn't really happen. Like that's disrespectful. That really is disrespectful to children. So I think that's part of it, is sort of being willing to sit in the discomfort of not knowing, but respecting and loving children enough to say, we're going to have this really difficult conversation together.
That's right. No, that's right. I think that's an important point, right? That I want to sort of underscore and really engage with our sort of audience, right? Is that we talk a lot about the importance of the first 1,000 days, right? Infant toddler years, a lot of brain development because of experiences, et cetera, et cetera. We talk about the preschool years. It's critically important to laying the foundation for school and life, right? I always argue you can't say all those words and then say, you know what, I can't talk to any of these young people at this age about based like race and racism, discrimination, bias, etc. Yes, there are developmentally appropriate ways to have those conversations, as you have noted, Fabienne. But we cannot go through and say we should not, right? So there was a report, a survey from the American Psychological Association that found that adults said wait to 8. So talk to children about race and any of those related issues. And I would argue, based on our own science of neurocognitive development, that is way too late. Because at least by the age of 4 or 5, they're already making decisions and thoughts about race, their skin color, what it means about power and privilege. They may not have fully formed those words in a way that you want to fully receive as adults, but they have already made decisions about their peer groups, about what they're seeing in the world. And so your lack of engagement, as you have said, Fabian, their lack of engagement doesn't mean that they're not already, those are neurons that are not connected. They're connected. They may just not be based on facts. And so I think you make a really important point. And I think the other important point you also, I think, raised, which is important for this conversation, is that the early care education learning environment has a place to play in this, right? In that we need to talk about issues of race, but racism, right? We have to talk about issues of whether it's ableism, or classism, right? There are ways to talk about these things because kids actually do recognize, as one of my colleagues, Ani Rogers, talks about, kids are scientists, right? Their job is literally to see, to inquire, to make decisions, experiment, and then something happens, right? So it's really, I think, like you said, appreciate, value, and respect the brain development and cognitive and social development, emotional development of our young children. And our classrooms have a space and a power to play in that, and all those who obviously care for and teach our children. So really, as we sort of 10 minutes before we have Q&A from our attendees, and of course, attendees, I encourage you to add in your questions in the chat, and we'll definitely be gathering them. I do want to sort of, this is obviously being hosted by, the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, Trust for Learning, as well as Grantmakers. Make sure I got it right. What is it? Grantmakers for Education. Do I have that? I have that right. Okay, good. I want to make sure I got the main speakers here, right? So this means that y'all are funders, right? These are funders. And so what are our provocations for funders in this room? Like, right, I mean, because we have seen some of them sort of like pull back when they heard no more DEI, which I didn't hear that before. But what are your provocations? So Ellen, do you want to respond as somebody who works, as one of the co-directors of Trust for Learning?
Sure. I'll take off my Trust for Learning hat for a second and put on my Ellen hat, which is, this conversation is really about early childhood as kind of a sensitive period and connecting that to our larger vision as a democracy. But to the extent that people in this room have money, there are so many good ways to spend it in the next few months, and so many ways to think about investing in whatever you believe our democratic ideals should be. And I think public education, public schools, early childhood are a critical place to invest. And that's probably the reason that we're all on this call, because we have that in common. But that there are many other ways. And so depending on, the structure of your funding, that could be like releasing more money than you typically do in a given year. It could be reinvesting in DEI efforts. It could be, if you have C4 capacity, doing the things that many of us operating under C3 cannot. So that's one piece of it that I think we all want to push out there is like, people are spending a lot of money related to the election. So if you are fortunate enough to have extra, this is probably a good time to make good use of it. So I'll start there and hand off, and we may have some dialogue about this. And of course, Yoma, I want to hear what you're thinking.
Fabienne, what do you think? What should we, strongly encourage funders? And I should say, I didn't read this in Fabienne's bio, but she was at WT Grant for about 3 years, correct? But you could say more, please.
Yes. I took a leave from my faculty position for 3 years to see how the other side lived, the other half lives, people who give money away instead of always asking for money like we do when we're faculty. And it was a great experience. But I would say, from my experience in that foundation, where one of the things that I appreciate most about it is I would consider William T. Grant to be a very courageous foundation in taking stances on things that are important and not being able to say the quiet part out loud. And I think that would be my provocation for funders who are listening, is be courageous, be bold. Like Ellen, mentioned, you may have extra dollars, invest them wisely, invest them for our democracy in this moment. And foundations have a lot of power because they have purse strings, right? They have money. And when you have money, you have power. So you must, because of that power, use it in such a way that it can benefit people who would otherwise be marginalized, forgotten, not given any attention to. How can you find a way within how your, maybe the way that your funding is organized and the sort of like, this is what we fund. Is there any way for you to fund organizing in local communities? Is there any way for you to fund family organizers, parent organizers, youth organizers? Is there any way for you to really kind of push the limits of what might be considered, our portfolio, but to do it in such a way that it can really move things forward in this critical moment? Because I think we all can agree, this is a critical turning point for this country. Like, we are teetering on the brink. And so anything that anybody can do, I think we owe ourselves to do it. And I think foundations, instead of shying away from things because of the direction of the winds, I think this is the time to really stand firm.
Thank you both. And I want to also add, that in many ways, those who are leading foundations, as you said, have a lot of power and can put it in many public institutions, community-based organizing, et cetera. I will say that part of it could also be putting it into legal spaces. We saw we saw funders, I'm not gonna say a lot, but we saw funders who, when they saw the Supreme Court response, their disclosures ruling, I should say, on the case against UNC and Harvard regarding using race as one of the markers for entrance, right? People took that as, oh, that means we can use race for anything whatsoever. Like, we are now post-racial, which we're not. There's no evidence for that at all. And so I think this is a moment also for funders to understand that if a lot of our institutions, right, and a lot of our civil liberties are at risk, right, that part of it is to really make sure that you don't pull back out of fear or, but to really lean into it for those who literally need you at the table, right? We don't need you when it's good and high and everybody loves you. We need you when issues are hard, right? There's no, as Ellen said earlier, there's no fence here, right? It's either you're here or you're not. You got to pick a lane. And I think it's really important for funders to actually show who they really are. And some of them sadly showed it, right? But I think many also showed that they are here really for fighting for justice for communities that have continued to fight for this country and the liberation and leaning into the ideals of the country. And it's important that we honor those sort of fights. And so I will say that founders need to, I think, also be at the pulpit, right? They need to also speak clearly and strongly because they also have relationships and networks, those that are visible and those that are not visible to some of us. And so I say both with the purse string, but also with the power of your networks, that those could be powerful engines of change and also engines of moving things forward. So thank you for that. I want to sort of call in, to you all too, to sort of talk to us about what would fighting look like for funders? Like what, you mentioned a couple already. What do you say to funders who are like, we just want to be able to give money away and not have to get into, say, legal lawsuits. We just want to not have to deal with that just in case we're sued, right? What does that look like in the different spaces that they're likely to be needed beyond just, say, giving money for community organizing or public education, or other kinds of things? What does that look like in different spaces from your point of view? So how can they fight? Fabian, you want to try?
I mean, in my experience, a foundation's board is incredibly important as a partner in providing guidance and advice, but also in very much being protective and in speaking out on behalf of, and in making space, right? And in allowing for things to happen, changing rules, right? So there are times when, for example, there are rules that a board has to approve all of these grants that are under or above X number. But during the pandemic, when things were really dire, William T. Grant Foundation asked their board to approve what they called rapid response grants. And those grants were, I think, maybe, I'm not going to get this number right, but let's just say it was $100,000. And like typically we would have to go to the board for that amount of money. But the board agreed, okay, this is a situation, right? Like this is urgent. We need this urgently. So we're going to waive that for this current moment and say, if it's for this particular initiative of rapid response, then you don't need our approval for that, right? So there are ways that boards can really be supportive. And then depending on the size of the foundation, you might even have legal counsel. And one of the things that we found out as NYU Metro Center at NYU, because we're the Metropolitan Center for Equity, right? Research on equity and the transformation of schools. And sometimes we piss people off. Sometimes we put out reports and people want to sue us. Sometimes people, put out reports and they want to complain that we've done this wrong and we've been deceitful. And general counsel at NYU is like, here's what you're not going to do. So if you can't, when you have those kinds of supports and resources, like it's incredibly important. So being able, I think that speaks to your point, Yoma, about leveraging the networks and the resources who can support you. In addition to knowing, again, that yes, you have the money, and so you can do the money, but also you don't want the blowback in the sense that somehow now you're not going to be able to be helpful, right? Because now you've broken the law, right? So let's not do that. But how can we leverage all of these different entities that are in place to support us, in order to be able to do what is necessary?
Thank you for that, Fabian. And Ellen, so as we talk about this conversation, right, about early learning could be a space for sort of civically conscious teaching and learning, and we have seen the pushback, right, in even talking about whether it's gender identity, racial identity, if it got a D, or E, or I in it, that particularly in the South here where I live, Carolina and beyond, right? The thoughts of it are like, oh my goodness, it's propaganda and you're messing with our kids' head. How do how do funders also respond potentially this idea, right? As this series continues forward, right? that people are not going to feel like, oh, now we're talking about democracy. Why do our kids need to know democracy when they could just, first of all, how about they learn to read and write, right? And do some math, right? So what is your response to that? And also to the educators who are like, I'm just trying to get them to sit still because I think they have problems, right? So how could both funders, I think, help to sharpen and provide the resource supports, but also what is the response to how people will probably see this conversation as another way of sort of introducing sort of propaganda and DI, et cetera, et cetera?
I so appreciate that question. And I recognize how privileged I am to be, living in Washington, D.C., where essentially nothing, I don't think, on our ballot coming up is frightening, in a pretty politically homogenous, if not, politically homogenous community. So I recognize that completely. One of the things I think from a funding perspective is, and this builds on a couple of the things that you both have said, continue investing, invest more in, do not retreat from investing in partners who are literally working in communities with children. Because unlike funders who tend to fund in silos, we're like, well, here's my early childhood portfolio, and I'll do some democracy work over here. And what about climate change? If you are running an early childhood, childcare center, you are the teacher, you are the cook, you are the person thinking about shade when it's too hot out, right? You are not working in silos. You are the provider. You're also the person who's trusted in the community when it's like, hey, election day is coming up. How are we all supporting each other with childcare? Because we as a country have not decided, that we're going to invest in making sure people can get to the polls. So continuing to get as much money into the hands of people who are doing this community work underfunded is the most important thing. And so I do not at all, I was even hesitant to use the word civic education or even the word democracy in this series, because it's not about adding another acronym to the framework. It's about seeing the ways that all of these issues are connected. And the other provocation for myself, but for funders, is to really think about how we support all of the adults who are affected by our systemic lack of investment in public education, starting from the prenatal period, from birth. And I think so much about the untapped political power of parents, of educators, and looking to communities where educators are organizing and supporting them. I saw a link to a trailer for a new documentary that's coming out called Making a Circle, which is about childcare educators organizing to improve policy. And we've seen this in places all over the country. Friends of ours, colleagues of ours in Connecticut organized a massively successful Morning Without Childcare in Connecticut that led to investments in the budget. So I really don't, the election, of course, is sort of the hook for this series, but it's so much more about what are the daily investments that funders are making. How are those investments supporting systemic policy so that funders don't have to continue propping up a system that is failing parents and educators? So I think for me, I see them all related and do not want to add another D to DEI that is democracy, but instead want to talk about how these things are connected. I'm going to drop that link in the chat. But yeah, the power of the adults in the room, right? We can't, as I think one of you said this last week when we were prepping, this is not about waiting 18 years, to be like, oh, let's invest in babies and they'll save democracy. Like, no. So what are we doing?
No, thank you. No, thank you for that. And of course, reminding the attendees, feel free to, and continue, obviously we appreciate the engagement, but also feel free to also add in your questions. So I can send it up here to both Fabian and Ellen. And want to sort of just call out a couple of things that were shared in the chat. I think, Ellen, when you mentioned about sort of how, there's lobbying that's possible. There's a certain amount you can actually lobby and a few people. And I think you obviously included a link. So I encourage people to look at that, the link that's being shared as well, in terms of what funders could do to sort of be part of the change and not sort of be silent, or at least, stay in the middle in many ways. So really appreciate that. As we're sharing, you've shared a lot of resources, but as we're sharing resources, I would love to sort of have both of you talk about what other resources do you want to share to really help, folks in the attendees situate themselves in this moment, better understand what's at stake, and also internalize what action is required of them, right? As I think I read earlier from E. Du Bois, right? Like the idea is that some of us are fighting for many things. And so just trying to ask, are there resources that you'd like to share? Oh, I should say, Fabian, would you like to go, please?
Yeah, sure. So I prepared 3 resources that I would like to share with folks. First is a book list from Lee and Low Books. They are a publisher that publishes books, kind of really centering human diversity and justice and equity. So they have this specific book list on books about civics, and they have examples of books running all the way from, for pre-K all the way up through high school. So that's a useful resource. Another one is featuring some of the work of NYU Metro Center in supporting parent organizing. So this is kind of like a series of stories based on our work that I think can be inspiring to folks, and that funders might be able to be inspired by and see ways that they could also perhaps, fuel these kinds of things. And then the third one is a book, and it is called A Chance for Change. It is a book about the founding of Head Start that is just kind of an inspiring in terms of thinking about like organizing for early childhood education. How do people organize? It's all about Mississippi's Black freedom struggle and how Head Start was folded into that. So I think just in terms of looking for inspiration, looking for ideas, these are great resources.
Thank you for that, Fabian. And I know people probably are thinking and asking, all these links that are being shared will be called together and sent forth. I hope I'm right with that. Correct, Stephanie, Ellen, teams, all that. So I know people are probably like, click, 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 and then they forget about it because something happened. But these links will be shared with you in one aggregate form, I think also as a follow-up. So Ellen, do you want to share any additional resources with the attendees?
Yeah, I realize we're sort of inducing for people all the tabs in a row across their browser, so apologies for that. I do want to make sure people are aware of the lens through which Trust for Learning thinks and works. So we're a philanthropic partnership, and our whole mission is guided by these 9 really simple principles of what we call ideal learning environments for young children, which start with commitment to racial equity, among other dimensions of equity. And just to share something I didn't share already around the origin of what we call ideal learning approaches, which range across different settings and are not a curriculum, but really a way of thinking about how young children develop and responding to them in an educational setting. And several of them came out of the sort of devastation of war. Or the devastation of intense poverty. And so I think a lot about, in a period of despite all the challenges of relative stability in the United States economically, like, let's not wait for the crisis to then rebuild public education after a shakeup. So just emphasizing that, and the connection between adult development and thinking of educators and parents as continually developing people too, who are engaging with young children and thinking about the role of adults in the room. And then the only other thing that I wanted to share was just, feel free to contact me offline about this. It's not part of the Trust mission, but if you are just sort of worrying about the election, there are so many ways to be helpful in very practical terms. And it's not just about who's at the top of the ticket, but that particular race will be decided by a tiny margin of people in a couple of states in this country. So if you're ever doom scrolling, there are ways to actually get involved and help. And people don't vote for lots of different reasons, but some of the main barriers to voting, I do get out the vote work and I knock on people's doors, and the things I hear are, I have to go to work. Oh, the election's today, I can't find my ID card, depending on what the restrictions are in that state. There are so many practical barriers to voting that we should work on changing, but people need help getting to the polls. So it impacts every aspect of public education and early childhood. So if you're interested, feel free to get in touch with me offline.
Thank you for that, both of you, I think, sharing. And really, I'm going to actually pass the torch back to Ellen and the partners, the funding partners, to do some closing. But I want to leave attendees with, the idea that this is a series of conversations, because democracy still needs us and will need us regardless, even after the election, and on and on and on. And so I really encourage each and every one of you to really think through what is your part that you're going to play, and not one that's just performative, but really one that leads into the livelihood, that leans into social justice and really leans into what our children need us to do, so that we don't wait to 18 years, as we have said already, for us to make the change needed for progress, inclusion, but also really liberation for many of those who have not been fully free, whether psychologically, socially, emotionally, economically. And so really, I want to thank the co-hosts, the funders for really starting this conversation, and know that there's many other conversations. So with that, I want to thank Fabian and Ellen really for their really thoughtful, provocative, and really insightful comments, and obviously research as well. And so I'll hand this over to Ellen to sort of close us out, if I may.
So I will not use my full 3 minutes. So Fabienne, any other final words from you real quick, and then I'll take like 10 seconds for my little plug.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Thank you both for having this conversation. The one thing I want to say is this is episode 1, conversation 1 in a series, and the next one that we have lined up in August, we have the link available to sign up for, and I think it's going to really build on this conversation, but with the specific lens of language development. So Dr. Chantel Meek leads a wonderful organization called Children's Equity Project, close collaborator of all of us, and she will be engaging with a number of people thinking about bilingual development, multilingual development, and specifically saving and sustaining Indigenous languages in this country. So connecting the dots, right, between, it's not just about English language learners, right, or bilingual children, right? It's not just about the policy framework. It's about what does it actually mean for children to have access to their language and their culture, and what will it take to invest in that for all children. So I think that panel is going to be fabulous, and I think we're going to drop the link in the chat here, and we're hoping to see you there. And with that, that was all I was going to say. So I'll hand back over to Stephanie or Rena if we have any other closing remarks.
Happy to close us out. An hour really flies. And so as Ellen mentioned, this is part 1 of a multi-part conversation. We hope that you'll join us in August. But thank you to Ihioma, to Fabienne, and to Ellen for your deep and insightful reflections. We really appreciate everyone for joining us and for your engagement in the chat. By way of some very final closing announcements, as a reminder, we'll have the recording from this session available in about a week. We love for folks to stay connected to our work. So there's a QR code in this slideshow where you can sign up for additional updates from Grantmakers for Education. And then one more just plug on some upcoming programming. As we mentioned, part 2 of this specific series is going to be taking place August 8th. With a focus on language development and learning for early learning as well as for youth development. We'd love for folks to join us in any of our summer programming, including our in-person study tour in Montgomery. Our annual conference is coming up in October, and registration is open now. So we hope to see you at a future program, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your week.